The cops showed up while I was carrying my 12-year-old daughter's art supplies into our family cabin. All because HOA President Marlene Thorne decided that a grieving widower was somehow violating community standards. Picture this. I'm holding Sophie's rainbow easel, pine needles crunching underfoot, when red and blue lights reflect off the lake. Two deputies roll up because this clipboard-wielding tyrant called them on her father moving his late wife's belongings. What Marlene didn't know was that I'd spent 23 years as a real estate attorney, and my brilliant daughter Sophie was about to help me turn her precious HOA into our personal playground. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if some power-hungry neighbor called the cops on you during your worst moment? And where are you watching from? I want to see how many of you have survived HOA nightmares like this. Let me back up and explain how we got here. I'm Garrett Blackwood, 52, recently retired real estate attorney from Denver. 8 months ago, my world collapsed when my wife Sarah lost her battle with cancer. She was the heart of our family, the one who organized everything, remembered everyone's birthdays, and made our little house feel like home. Our daughter Sophie, 12, was Sarah's mini-me. Before the cancer, she was outgoing, asked a million questions, and documented everything in her worn notebook, a habit she picked up while helping her mom organize medical appointments. After Sarah died, Sophie shut down. She stopped talking to friends, stopped drawing, stopped being the curious kid who used to drive us crazy with her constant research projects. Our Denver house felt like a tomb. Sarah's coffee cup still sat by the kitchen sink. Sophie's bedroom door stayed closed most days. We were drowning in memories, and I knew we needed an escape. That's when I remembered our lake cabin at Pineview Shores, a weathered sanctuary I'd inherited from my dad 30 years ago. The place smelled of cedar and old leather, with that squeaky third floorboard by the kitchen that had announced midnight snack raids since I was Sophie's age. The dock planks felt rough and familiar under bare feet, and each evening, loons called across the water as if welcoming us home for the first time in months. Sophie finally showed interest in something. She stood at the lake's edge, toes curling into the sandy bottom, and whispered, "Mom would like it here." That's when I decided we'd spend the rest of the summer at the cabin, maybe longer. What I didn't know was that our little corner of paradise came with a 47-home Homeowners Association run by a woman who could make a prison warden look flexible. Meet Marlene Thorne, 64 years old, steel gray bob that never moved in the wind, and a clipboard permanently attached to her right hand like a bureaucratic appendage. She drove a white Lexus SUV that looked like it was detailed weekly. And she'd been HOA president for 12 years, unopposed, because apparently nobody else wanted to spend their retirement terrorizing neighbors over mailbox colors. The Pineview Shores HOA managed 47 lakefront homes, charged $400 monthly dues, and enforced a 23-page covenant document that read like the Geneva Convention. Marlene had assembled a rubber-stamp board of cronies who approved anything she suggested, from fining people for excessive bird feeding to declaring certain dock stain colors non-regulation. I started moving our belongings over Labor Day weekend. Sophie helped quietly, carrying small boxes and occasionally pointing out interesting birds or asking about the boats moored at the docks. It was the most engagement I'd seen from her since the funeral. On day 2, Marlene appeared like a bad rash. She marched down our gravel driveway with her clipboard and measuring tape, wearing the kind of self-satisfied expression you see on someone who just found a parking violation. The morning air still held that crisp pine scent, but somehow her presence made everything feel stale. "Excuse me," she announced, not bothering to ask permission to be on our property. "I'm Marlene Thorne, HOA president. That moving truck violates our temporary vehicle parking ordinance, 72-hour limit." I explained we were still in the process of moving, that my wife had recently passed, and we needed some flexibility during a difficult time. Her response, "Grief doesn't exempt you from community standards, $50 per day after the grace period expires." Then she spotted Sophie's bright purple desk and rainbow art easel being carried through the front door. "Those items are visible through your windows," Marlene declared, scribbling notes. "They violate our neutral decor standards. You'll need to remove or cover all non-compliant children's furnishings." Sophie, who had been listening from the doorway, heard this woman criticize her belongings, the first spark of emotion I'd seen from her in months. But it wasn't sadness, it was anger. When I refused Marlene's demands, she threatened enforcement action. I should have known she was just getting started. What I didn't expect was how this fight would awaken something fierce in my daughter. The next morning, I woke to the sound of car doors slamming. Through the kitchen window, I watched Marlene march up our driveway with what she called her official HOA inspection team, basically her +2 reluctant cronies. Sophie sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, still in her pajamas, when she spotted the approaching tribunal. "Dad," she whispered, grabbing her ever-present notebook. "They're back." Marlene knocked like she was serving a warrant. When I opened the door, she thrust a stack of professional-looking violation notices at me, each stamped with an official seal that probably came from Staples. "Multiple violations requiring immediate attention," she announced, reading from her clipboard like she was handing down a court sentence. "Unapproved exterior lighting, $75. Non-regulation dock stain color, $125. Excessive personal property visible through windows, $200. As she rattled off our supposed crimes against humanity, her inspection team wandered around our property taking photographs. One guy snapped pictures of Sophie's bicycle leaning against the cabin wall. Another focused on her swing set through the window. That's when Sophie noticed something I'd missed in my grief-induced fog. "Dad," she whispered, tugging at my sleeve, "don't they need permission to take pictures?" I'd been a real estate attorney for over 2 decades, but sometimes it takes a 12-year-old to remind you of the basics. The HOA covenant, which I should have reviewed more carefully, required 48 hours written notice for property inspections. Here's a tip every homeowner should know: most HOA covenants require advance notice for inspections. They can't just show up with cameras like property paparazzi. I walked over to Marlene, who was busy directing her photographer toward Sophie's art easel. "Marlene, I need to see your copy of the covenant." She fumbled through her papers, clearly not expecting to be questioned. "I don't need to," I said calmly. Section 4.7, Inspection Notice Requirements. You needed to provide 48 hours written notice. Since you didn't, all these violations are invalid due to improper procedure. I refused to pay the fines and demanded a new inspection with proper notice. That's when Marlene's professional mask slipped for the first time. Her face flushed red, and that clipboard started trembling in her hands like a chihuahua in a thunderstorm. "I've been running this community since before you decided to dump your big city problems on us." The prejudice leaked out like water through a cracked dam. "We have standards here that maybe Denver people don't understand." Sophie, who had been watching the exchange from the doorway, spoke up loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mom always said, bullies pick on people when they are sad." The silence that followed was beautiful. Marlene's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her inspection team suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Even the morning birds seemed to stop chirping. "This isn't over," Marlene finally managed, storming toward her SUV. The sharp crack of her car door slamming echoed across the lake, followed by the diesel smell of her oversized vehicle. Because, of course, she drove something that needed a ladder to get into. As her Lexus disappeared down the road, trailing exhaust and wounded pride, I realized something important. This wasn't about HOA rules or community standards. This was personal. Marlene had targeted us because we were vulnerable, because she thought a grieving widower with a traumatized daughter would be easy prey. But here's what she didn't understand. Sophie was already showing signs of the sharp mind that had made her mother such a formidable organizer. That quiet observation about needing permission for photographs, it was pure analytical thinking, starting to emerge from months of grief-induced silence. For the first time since Sarah died, Sophie smiled. Really smiled. "Can we fight back, Dad?" I looked at my daughter standing there in her butterfly pajamas, notebook clutched against her chest, and saw a glimpse of the fierce kid who used to challenge her teachers when she thought they'd made mistakes. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said. "We can fight back." For the first time since Sarah's death, Sophie seemed like herself again. And if taking on an HOA tyrant was what it took to get my daughter back, I was all in. What I didn't know yet was that Marlene Thorne had been playing fast and loose with far more than inspection procedures, and my methodical, detail-oriented daughter was about to become the worst nightmare of every corrupt HOA president in America. The war was just beginning. 3 days later, Sophie and I were in the living room, working together to position her mother's upright piano, the same one where Sarah had taught Sophie to play for Elise before the cancer treatments made her fingers too weak to reach the keys. The piano wasn't huge, but it took both of us to maneuver it into the corner where the afternoon light would hit the keys just right. Sophie directed me like a tiny foreman. A little left. Dad, no, too much. Perfect. That's when we heard the gravel crunch of approaching vehicles. 2 sheriff's deputies climbed out of their patrol cars, looking about as thrilled to be there as I felt watching them arrive. Behind them, Marlene emerged from her white Lexus with the satisfied smirk of someone who thought she had played a winning card. The older deputy, a guy who looked like he'd rather be fishing, approached with his hands up in the universal "this is awkward" gesture. "Sorry to bother you folks," he said. "We got a noise complaint and a call about a possible property dispute. Behind us says there's been some kind of ongoing harassment situation." I looked at Sophie, peeking out from behind the piano, and felt that familiar surge of protective anger. This woman had actually called the police on a father and daughter moving a piano. "Officers," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm Garrett Blackwood. This is my daughter Sophie. We're moving into our family cabin. And that piano belonged to my late wife, Sophie's mother." Sophie stepped forward, still clutching her notebook. "Mom taught me to play before she got sick," she said quietly. "It's not very loud." The younger deputy, who probably had kids of his own, immediately softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, sweetheart." "How long ago did your mom pass?" the older deputy asked. 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, Sophie answered with the precision of a child who counts everything. That's when Marlene made her fatal mistake. "Ibex stories don't change property law violations," she interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Both deputies turned to stare at her as if she'd just kicked a puppy. The older deputy cleared his throat. "We're here about a noise complaint. There's no noise ordinance violation, and this appears to be a civil matter between neighbors. Here's something every homeowner needs to understand. Police cannot enforce HOA rules. They're civil contracts, not criminal law. Don't let HOA bullies convince you otherwise." After the officers left, apologizing and suggesting we work things out neighborly, I spent the evening doing what I should have done weeks ago, research. Sophie spread all our HOA documents across the dining table like she was preparing for final exams. She had organized everything with color-coded highlighters, yellow for rules, green for finances, pink for anything that seemed weird. "Dad," she said, looking up from a stack of board meeting minutes, "this rule about window decorations isn't in the original covenant from 2019. I leaned over her shoulder. She was right. The neutral decor standards Marlene had cited didn't exist in the original HOA covenant. Someone had added them later. "Keep looking, sweetheart," I said, pulling up county property records on my laptop. "Let's see what else doesn't add up." That's when we found the first real smoking gun. I discovered that Marlene's house had been purchased in 2006, at the height of the housing bubble, probably more than she could afford. Cross-referencing with HOA financial records, I found a curious entry, a $47,000 landscaping assessment approved by board vote in 2021. Sophie, meanwhile, had created a timeline in her notebook. "Dad, look at this. The landscaping money got approved the exact same month Mrs. Thorne got that fancy garden with the stone pathway and fountain." I stared at the timeline my 12-year-old daughter had constructed. The HOA had paid for Marlene's personal garden renovation. But according to the covenant, the real covenant, not Marlene's modified version, no individual property improvements could be funded by community dues. "Sophie," I said slowly, "I think Marlene's been stealing from the HOA." Her eyes lit up with the first genuine excitement I'd seen since her mother died. "Can we prove it?" "We're going to try," I said. That night, Sophie stayed up past her bedtime, cross-referencing documents and creating charts that would make a forensic accountant proud. I found her asleep at the table the next morning, her head pillowed on a stack of financial reports, notebook filled with questions and observations. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, I felt hope, not just about exposing Marlene's corruption, but about my daughter. Sophie had found her purpose again. She was channeling her grief into something powerful, the pursuit of truth. Marlene had no idea she was about to face a 12-year-old with a photographic memory, organizational skills that would shame most adults, and a very personal grudge against people who abuse their power. The real fight was just beginning. The next evening, Sophie and I were sitting on the dock, watching the sunset paint the lake gold, when we heard voices drifting across the water. Marlene was hosting what she called an emergency community meeting at her house. Judging by the cars in her driveway, it looked more like a carefully curated gathering of allies. Sophie pulled out her phone and opened her voice recorder app. "Dad, if she's lying about us, she's probably lying about other stuff too, right?" "Smart kid." The houses around the lake sat close together, and with the windows open for the evening breeze, we could hear most of what was being said. Marlene's voice carried clearly across the water as she painted us as some kind of threat to their peaceful community. "That moving truck has been here for days," she said. "And you should see the garish children's furniture they've put right in the front windows. This isn't the kind of family that respects our established norms." Sophie scribbled notes in her ever-present notebook, documenting who was there, what was said, and most importantly, what was factually wrong. The moving truck had been there for exactly 71 hours. Sophie's desk was purple, not garish. And since when did established norms include discriminating against families with children? The next morning, Marlene launched Phase 2 of her campaign, a community standards newsletter that appeared in everyone's mailbox. It featured anonymous neighbor complaints about new residents who didn't respect the quiet, family-friendly atmosphere that made Pineview Shore special. Sophie read the newsletter over breakfast, her analytical mind picking apart every sentence. "Dad," she said. "She says we have multiple vehicles, but we only have your truck. And she says our loud renovations are disturbing people, but we haven't renovated anything." "She's hoping nobody will fact-check her," I said. "Well, she's wrong," Sophie replied, with a determination that reminded me so much of Sarah it made my chest tighten. That afternoon, Jim Reeves knocked on our door. He was a retired mechanic from 3 houses down, a widower who'd lost his wife the year before and understood something about grief and starting over. "Wanted to warn you," he said, glancing around like Marlene might be watching from the bushes. "She's been making the rounds, talking to everyone about you folks. Some people are buying it, but not all of us." Jim became our first ally. Through him, we learned the community was more divided than Marlene wanted us to believe. There were longtime residents who'd known the lake before Marlene's iron fist, and then there was her inner circle, who benefited from her selective enforcement of rules. "That woman's been terrorizing this place for years," Jim said. "Most folks are just too tired to fight back." That evening, Sophie made her biggest discovery yet. While I was making dinner, she spread every HOA document we had across the dining table and started cross-referencing them with the Colorado Secretary of State's corporate database. "Dad," she called from the table, her voice carrying that excited pitch she used when she solved a particularly challenging math problem. "You need to see this." I walked over to find Sophie staring at her laptop screen, a printed page in one hand and her highlighter in the other. "The HOA isn't even a real company anymore," she said. I looked at the screen. According to the Secretary of State's records, the Pineview Shores Homeowners Association had failed to file its required annual reports for 3 consecutive years. Its corporate status had been automatically dissolved. "What does that mean?" Sophie asked. "It means," I said slowly, the full implications sinking in, that Marlene has been collecting dues and issuing violations with zero legal authority. The HOA has no power to enforce anything. Here's something every homeowner should know. Always verify an HOA's corporate status with your Secretary of State. Many lose their authority through simple paperwork lapses. Sophie was practically bouncing in her chair. All those fines she'd handed out were completely meaningless. I finished explaining, but Sophie was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Dad, if we can prove she knew the HOA wasn't real, isn't that fraud?" I stared at my 12-year-old daughter, sitting there surrounded by legal documents, having just uncovered what might be the biggest HOA scandal in the county. Sarah would have been so proud. "Sophie," I said, "I think you just found our smoking gun. Can we tell everyone?" "Not yet," I replied. "Let's gather more evidence first. If Marlene's been running a fake HOA for 3 years, I want to know exactly how much money she's stolen and from whom." That night, Marlene called my cell phone directly. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, HOA office. I'll be there, I said. And Garrett, she added, come prepared to discuss compliance with community standards, or we'll be forced to take legal action. After I hung up, Sophie looked up from her research. Dad, can I come to the meeting? I want to see her face when she tries to lie to us. Looking at my daughter, analytical, determined, and completely fearless, I realized Marlene had made a critical error. She'd picked a fight with a grieving family she thought would be easy targets. Instead, she'd awakened something powerful in Sophie, a passion for justice that would make her mother proud. Yeah, sweetheart, I said. I think it's time Mrs. Thorne met the new Sophie Blackwood. The next afternoon, Sophie and I walked into Marlene's so-called HOA office, a converted shed behind her house that smelled of mothballs and bureaucratic delusions. Marlene sat behind a folding table, her entire rubber stamp board flanking her like some kind of suburban tribunal. What they didn't expect was Sophie, carrying a 3-ring binder organized with color-coded tabs and a presentation folder that would make a law firm jealous. Mrs. Thorne, Sophie said, her voice steady and clear, my dad and I have been reviewing the HOA documents, and we found some interesting things. Marlene waved dismissively. Young lady, this is adult business. Actually, Sophie interrupted, opening her binder to a specific tab, I think this is everyone's business. According to the Colorado Secretary of State, your HOA hasn't been a legal corporation for 3 years. The silence in that musty shed was deafening. Sophie pulled out printed pages and laid them on the table like she was dealing cards. Here's your corporate registration from 2018. Here's the notice that you failed to file annual reports in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And here's the automatic dissolution notice. Board member Frank Kellerman leaned forward, squinting at the documents. Marlene, what's she talking about? This is children's nonsense. Marlene sputtered, but her face had gone pale. Administrative technicalities don't, she began. Mrs. Thorne, Sophie said calmly, my mom taught me that facts aren't technicalities. They're truth. And the truth is, you've been collecting dues and issuing fines with no legal authority whatsoever. I watched my daughter systematically dismantle 3 years of Marlene's power grab with the precision of a surgeon. She walked the board through the corporate dissolution timeline using charts she created, cross-referenced with county records and state filings. The legal implications were staggering. Without corporate status, the HOA had no authority to enforce covenants, collect dues, or issue violations. Every fine, every assessment, every official action since the dissolution was legally meaningless. If you were really helping our community, Sophie asked the board, why didn't you tell them the HOA wasn't real anymore? Rose Kellerman turned to stare at Marlene. You mean we've been paying dues to an organization that doesn't exist? That's when Jim Reeves, who had been quietly listening from the back, dropped his own bombshell. There's more, he said. I've seen Marlene meeting with those Pinnacle Properties developers. Been happening for months. Sophie flipped to another tab in her binder. I researched Pinnacle Properties. They specialize in lakefront development projects. But Dad found something interesting about our property deed. I produced the original deed, pointing to a section highlighted in Sophie's meticulous yellow marker. There's a legal easement protecting lakefront access that runs through the entire community, I explained. Any major development would violate it. Sophie connected the dots with a logical precision that had made her mother such a formidable researcher. So either Mrs. Thorne doesn't know about the easement, which means she's incompetent, or she does know and she's trying to sell something that isn't hers to sell. The board members sat in stunned silence as the scope of Marlene's deception became clear. She'd been running a fake HOA while secretly negotiating with developers about a project that was legally impossible. This is ridiculous, Marlene finally managed. I won't be lectured by a child who doesn't understand adult responsibilities. Sophie looked Marlene straight in the eye, with a calm that would have made Sarah proud. Mom taught me that adults who yell instead of explaining are usually wrong, she said. Frank Kellerman cleared his throat. Marlene, I think we need to see all the financial records tonight. And I think, added Rose, we need to call an emergency meeting of all homeowners, the real ones this time. As we walked back to our cabin, Sophie asked, Dad, Is it wrong that I'm excited to see her face when everyone finds out? I looked at my daughter, who had just exposed the biggest HOA fraud in county history using nothing but careful research and logical thinking. No, sweetheart, I said. Your mom always said that fixing something broken is better than just walking away, and that's exactly what we're going to do. That evening, Sophie spread her research across our dining table like a general planning a campaign. She had created what she called her neighbor research project, interviewing families under the guise of a school assignment about community living. Adults tell kids things they won't tell other adults, she explained, organizing her interview notes with the methodical precision she'd inherited from her mother. Mrs. Martinez told me all about her garden gnome find, and Mr. Rodriguez showed me the letter about his boat trailer. They think I'm just curious. Smart kid. While Sophie was conducting her unofficial census of Marlene's victims, Jim introduced me to the underground resistance neighbors who'd been quietly documenting their own harassment for years. Linda Martinez, a former bookkeeper who'd been fined $300 for unapproved garden decorations, aka 2 ceramic gnomes, brought a showbox full of violation notices. Mark Rodriguez, a contractor who'd been sanctioned for parking his work trailer in his own driveway, had photos of every arbitrary enforcement action he'd witnessed. Each family had the same story: arbitrary rules, personal vendettas, and impossible standards that somehow never applied to Marlene's friends. Sophie documented everything in her notebook with dates, quotes, and cross-references that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. By the end of the week, our coalition had grown to 8 households, nearly 20% of the community. I pretend I'm writing a report for school, Sophie explained to Linda, who was amazed by the 12-year-old's organizational skills. They don't realize I'm actually building a case, Sophie said with a quiet grin. The financial investigation was where Sophie's analytical mind really shone. She taught herself to read expense reports by watching YouTube videos, then created a simple tracking system that even the adults could follow. Linda, working with Sophie's organizational methods, found a pattern that made my attorney brain light up like a Christmas tree. Every major HOA expense coincided with board meetings attended only by Marlene's cronies, emergency drainage projects that only helped her street, landscaping assessments that somehow funded her personal garden, administrative fees paid to an LLC that, surprise, was registered to Marlene herself. Dad, look at this, Sophie said, showing me a timeline she created. Every time Mrs. Thorne's LLC got paid, it was approved the same day as a board meeting. Isn't that suspicious? Suspicious didn't begin to cover it. Our conservative estimate put Marlene's embezzlement at $67,000 over 4 years. Mark, who'd worked construction for 30 years, identified inflated contractor bills that were pure fiction. This invoice says they repaired the community dock for $15,000, he said, pointing to a receipt. I helped build that dock. It cost maybe $3,000 in materials. Tops. Sophie created visual aids that could have come from a university economics class, pie charts showing where Jews really went, timelines connecting Marlene's personal expenses with HOA expenditures, and a simple flowchart explaining how board members have a fiduciary duty to the community. Here's something every HOA homeowner should know: board members have a legal obligation to act in the community's best interest. Misusing funds isn't just unethical, it's grounds for personal liability. Our legal strategy was straightforward but required precise timing. Step 1. File corporate reinstatement with the Secretary of State. Sophie had found the forms online and walked me through the process like she'd been doing corporate law for decades. Step 2. Gather petition signatures for an emergency homeowner meeting. Step 3. Present our evidence publicly and demand Marlene's resignation. Step 4. If she refused, file a civil suit for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. Sophie insisted on contributing to the new bylaws we were drafting. We need rules that actually make sense for families, she said, suggesting policies about children's play equipment, reasonable noise standards, and transparent budgeting. Kids understand fairness better than adults sometimes. We should explain this so families get it. The psychological warfare phase was Sophie's idea. Instead of confronting Marlene directly, we'd let her anxiety do the work for us. Coalition members started attending board meetings, asking the innocent questions Sophie had prepared. Linda requested detailed financial records at every opportunity. Mark volunteered for community projects, quietly exposing the inflated contractor scams. Sophie noticed Marlene's increasing paranoia before any of us did. She keeps looking around like someone's watching her, Sophie observed after a recent board meeting. Mom always said guilty people punish themselves if you let them, she added wisely. We filed the corporate reinstatement paperwork in secret, restoring the HOA's legal status under the original bylaws, which required democratic elections and homeowner approval for major expenses. Marlene had no idea she'd just lost her illegitimate authority. Sophie gathered petition signatures by talking to neighborhood kids, who convinced their parents to sign. She collected 23 signatures, 49% of the community, in just 2 days. Let her think she's winning, Sophie suggested as we scheduled the emergency meeting. Mom always said that makes the fall harder. The emergency homeowner meeting was set for the following Saturday. Marlene still believed she was dealing with a grieving widower and his quiet daughter. She had no idea she was about to face a 12-year-old with a 3-ring binder full of evidence and the moral clarity that only comes from losing someone you love to something real, then watching someone else abuse power for something petty. Monday morning, Marlene called another emergency board meeting, this time without any homeowner notice, which was illegal under the very bylaw she claimed to uphold. Sophie and I watched from our kitchen window as her cronies shuffled into the converted shed like conspirators planning a coup. An hour later, official-looking notices appeared in everyone's mailboxes, a $2,500 immediate special assessment for critical infrastructure repairs. The kicker: my cabin was specifically cited as structurally noncompliant and unsafe for children. Sophie read the notice over my shoulder, her analytical mind immediately spotting the flaws. Dad, they didn't give anyone time to vote on this. And look, it says families with high-risk living situations have to pay extra. She looked up at me with those sharp eyes that miss nothing. She's targeting us because I'm here, isn't she? Smart kid. Marlene wasn't even trying to hide her discrimination anymore. That evening, Sophie insisted on attending the emergency meeting where Marlene tried to ram through her special assessment. We sat in the back while Marlene pontificated about maintaining standards and protecting property values. Sophie took detailed notes in her notebook, documenting every procedural violation. No advance notice to homeowners, no budget justification, no competitive bidding for the supposed repairs. When Marlene mentioned clearing problematic families, Sophie recorded it on her phone. She keeps saying families like yours, Sophie whispered. That's discrimination. Right, Dad. Right as rain, I said. Marlene was digging her own legal grave with every word. After the meeting, Jim pulled me aside with news that made my blood boil. He'd spotted Pinnacle Properties executives at Marlene's house again, this time with surveying equipment. They were measuring dock spaces and talking about clearing problematic homeowners. I think she's getting paid to force people out, he said. Sophie, who'd been using binoculars to observe Marlene's meetings like some kind of 12-year-old spy, confirmed Jim's suspicions. Dad, I saw them pointing at our cabin and the Rodriguez house. Mr. Rodriguez has been fighting that boat trailer fine for months. The pieces clicked into place. Marlene wasn't just embezzling HOA funds, she was taking bribes from developers to eliminate resistance to their lakefront project. She's getting paid to make families leave, Sophie said, her voice carrying that mix of outrage and excitement she got when solving a particularly complex puzzle. While Marlene thought she was cornering us with her special assessment, Sophie was building an airtight case for bribery and conspiracy. During her research, she discovered something that would blow up Marlene's entire scheme. Dad, remember that property deed with the easement? Sophie asked, pulling out her research folder. I kept reading, and guess what? The easement specifically protects family recreational use of the lakefront. Any development that restricts access for residents with children would violate federal law. My brilliant daughter had found the smoking gun. Not only was Marlene's deal with Pinnacle Properties based on embezzled HOA funds, but the entire development project was legally impossible. She either didn't know about the easement, which made her incompetent, or she did know, which made her a fraud. Sophie reasoned through it with a logical precision that would impress a law school professor. Behind the scenes, our coalition was documenting everything. Linda discovered that Marlene's personal LLC had received a $15,000 consulting fee from Pinnacle Properties the same week as a special assessment vote. Mark identified fake invoices for emergency dock repairs that had never happened, repairs that coincidentally would have prepared the docks for development access. Sophie's pattern recognition skills were becoming legendary among our allies. "Dad, look at this," she said, showing me a comparison chart she created. "Every fake invoice has the same handwriting. Mrs. Thorne wrote them all herself." The evidence pile was growing: embezzlement, bribery, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and now conspiracy to violate federal easement law. Sophie had built a case that would make seasoned prosecutors envious. Meanwhile, I had quietly filed the corporate reinstatement paperwork 3 days earlier. The Pineview Shores HOA was once again a legal entity governed by the original bylaws, which required democratic elections and homeowner approval for major expenditures. Marlene had no idea that her special assessment was not only illegal under state law, but now violated the HOA's own restored bylaws. "Let her think she's winning," Sophie suggested as we prepared for the nuclear option. "Mom always said that makes the fall harder." Sophie had gathered petition signatures for an emergency homeowner meeting by enlisting the neighborhood kids as her helpers. When a 12-year-old shows up at your door asking if you'd like to sign something about making the lake fair for families, most adults don't ask too many questions. In just 2 days, we secured 23 signatures, 49% of the community. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. Marlene still believed she was dealing with a grieving widower who would crumble under financial pressure. She had no idea she was about to face a 12-year-old with a photographic memory, a 3-ring binder full of evidence, and a deeply personal understanding of what happens when people abuse power over families who are already hurting. "Dad," Sophie said as we reviewed our presentation one final time, "is it wrong that I'm excited to see her face when everyone finds out?" "No, sweetheart," I replied softly. "Your mom would be proud." Tuesday morning, I woke up to find flyers tucked under windshield wipers across the neighborhood. Marlene had launched her own nuclear option, a community safety alert. The flyer claimed I was an unstable widower whose emotional state made me unfit to influence community decisions. It suggested that grief clouded my judgment about what was best for children and warned neighbors about aggressive behavior from out-of-state residents who don't understand our values. Sophie read the flyer over breakfast, and for the first time since this fight began, I saw genuine anger flash across her face, not her usual analytical curiosity, but real protective fury. "She's using Mom against us," Sophie said quietly, her hands trembling as she held the paper. "She's making Mom's death about her stupid power trip." I wanted to storm over to Marlene's house and unleash words that would make a sailor blush. But Sophie, in her 12-year-old wisdom, had a better plan. "Dad, remember what Mom always said about letting bullies hang themselves with their own rope." That afternoon, a local TV news crew showed up at Marlene's house. She had contacted Channel 7, claiming that an outside agitator was destroying the peaceful, family-friendly atmosphere of Pineview Shores. From our kitchen window, Sophie and I watched as Marlene staged interviews with her handpicked supporters, each one parroting the same lines about fearing my influence on their community. The reporter, a young guy who looked fresh out of journalism school, seemed to be eating it up. "She's really good at this lying thing," Sophie observed, scribbling notes as usual. "But Dad, I researched that reporter online. He has a daughter my age." Sophie disappeared into her room and reappeared 20 minutes later with her laptop and a carefully crafted email. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Fighting back," she said, typing with a focused determination that reminded me so much of Sarah. "I'm sending him the real story." Sophie's email was a masterpiece of 12-year-old logic and devastating facts. She introduced herself politely, explained that her mom had died 8 months earlier, and told him that Mrs. Thorne was using that tragedy to attack my dad and other families. Then she attached photos of her research binder, documents showing the corporate dissolution, and a timeline of financial irregularities. "My mom taught me that truth matters more than being comfortable," Sophie wrote. "Here's what really happened." The reporter's attitude shifted dramatically after receiving Sophie's email. Instead of filming Marlene's staged community meeting, he began asking pointed questions about HOA finances and corporate status. By Thursday, the narrative had completely flipped. Channel 7's evening broadcast no longer painted me as an outsider causing trouble. Instead, the headline blared, 12-year-old exposes HOA corruption. Marlene's carefully crafted story had unraveled in front of the entire county. But she wasn't finished yet. Friday morning, in a final desperate move, Marlene filed an emergency court motion to block our scheduled homeowner meeting. Her claim: that my petition was harassment and that allowing unstable individuals like me to call meetings threatened community stability. She reached under her desk and pulled out a thick folder, already tabbed and highlighted. Inside was case law from multiple states, precedent rulings, and legal commentary, all showing that minors could, in fact, participate in valid petition drives. Sophie's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. I already sent this to the court clerk, she explained matter-of-factly, with a cover letter reminding them that kids have rights too. By Friday afternoon, the judge denied Marlene's emergency motion. Her own attorney had likely advised her to let it go after reading Sophie's airtight legal research. Saturday morning arrived with a kind of clear, crisp air that only follows a storm. Sophie woke early, methodically reviewing her presentation notes one last time. She had transformed her three-ring binder into a weapon of truth, color-coded charts, simple timelines, and undeniable proof of every financial irregularity Marlene had tried to bury. I watched her glance at the photo on her nightstand, a picture of Sarah teaching her to play piano, both of them laughing at some long-forgotten mistake in the music. "Mom, I hope you're proud of me," Sophie whispered softly to the frame before snapping her binder shut. As we walked toward the community center, Sophie clutched her binder like a shield. The parking lot was already overflowing. Out of 47 homeowners, 43 had shown up, along with a Channel 7 reporter and a county sheriff's deputy I'd quietly requested for crowd control. "Dad," Sophie asked, pausing at the entrance, "this isn't just about us anymore, is it?" "No, sweetheart," I told her. "We're fighting for everyone, for families like ours, and for the kind of community your mom always wanted for you." She squared her shoulders and stepped forward with the confidence of someone twice her age. Marlene had no idea she was about to face a 12-year-old with a photographic memory, a binder full of evidence, and the moral clarity that only comes from losing someone you love to something real, while watching someone else abuse power over something so small. "Dad," Sophie whispered as we found our seats, "is it wrong that I can't wait to see her face when everyone finds out what she's been doing?" "No, sweetheart," I said with a small smile. "Justice is supposed to feel good." Inside, the community center buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as neighbors shuffled into their seats. The scent of burnt coffee from the ancient percolator lingered in the air, mixing with a tension you could practically taste. Sophie sat beside me in the front row, her binder organized with military precision, every page tabbed and ready for battle. It was a presentation that would go down as the most devastating takedown in HOA history. Marlene arrived fashionably late, strutting in with her lawyer, Bradford Pierce, a man in a $1,000 suit whose smug expression screamed billable hours. They seated themselves at the front table, still trying to project authority, as if the outcome of this day wasn't already sealed. That illusion ended quickly. The retired Judge Jim had recruited to moderate the meeting, banged the gavel, and called everyone to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emergency homeowner meeting called by petition. We'll hear from the petitioners first." Marlene immediately jumped to her feet. "This meeting violates proper procedures. We demand—" The judge interrupted politely. "This is homeowner business, not courtroom theater. The young lady may proceed." Sophie stood, walked to the podium, and adjusted the microphone with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. "My name is Sophie Blackwood," she began, her voice steady and clear. "My mom, Sarah, died 8 months ago, and Mrs. Thorne has been using that to hurt my family. But my mom always taught me that truth matters more than being comfortable." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Sophie opened her binder and began presenting her evidence with precision. She laid out the corporate dissolution timeline with highlighted documents, displayed financial irregularities on poster boards she had created, and walked the group through simple charts showing where community dues were supposed to go versus where they had actually gone. "Mrs. Thorne's HOA hasn't been a legal corporation for 3 years, Sophie explained, pointing to the official Secretary of State records. "That means every fine, every assessment, every rule she's enforced since 2021 has been completely meaningless. Rose Kellerman gasped. You mean we've been paying dues to nothing? Not nothing, Sophie corrected firmly. You've been paying Mrs. Thorne's personal expenses. Then came the financial bombshell. Using Linda's bookkeeping analysis combined with her own meticulous organization, Sophie revealed exactly how Marlene had embezzled $67,000 through fake landscaping projects, inflated contractor bills, and administrative fees funneled to her own LLC. Every time Mrs. Thorne's company got paid, Sophie continued, pointing to her chart, it was approved the very same day as a board meeting. If she was really helping our community, why did she have to hide what she was doing? Marlene's face turned from red to purple. I won't be lectured by a child who doesn't understand adult responsibilities, she snapped. Sophie met her glare with calm, unshaken resolve. My mom taught me that adults who yell instead of explaining are usually wrong. The room erupted with appreciative murmurs. Even Bradford Pierce, Marlene's expensive attorney, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Then Sophie played her recording, Marlene's conversation with Pinnacle Properties executives, where she promised to clear out problem families in exchange for consulting fees. Gasps rippled across the room as the betrayal sank in. Their HOA president had been selling them out for personal gain. Mark Rodriguez shot to his feet, his face burning with anger. You were trying to force us out for money. And furthermore, Sophie continued, pulling out the original property deed, the development Mrs. Thorne was helping plan would violate federal easement law protecting family lakefront access. She was either too incompetent to know this, or she knew and still chose to commit fraud. Bradford Pierce leaned in and whispered urgently to Marlene, likely begging her to stop before she buried herself further. But Marlene was beyond reason. You people don't understand what it takes to maintain community standards, she shouted. Some of us have been protecting property values since before outsiders decided our rules don't apply to them. There it was, her prejudice and entitlement laid bare for everyone to see. The retired judge called the room back to order. We will now vote on a motion of no confidence in the current board. The result was devastating. 39 in favor, only 4 opposed, Marlene and her 3 loyal cronies. Furthermore, announced Frank Kellerman, I move that we elect an interim board with Mr. Blackwood as president and Mrs. Martinez as treasurer, and that we pursue criminal charges for embezzlement. The motion passed unanimously, with the exception of Marlene's table. A county sheriff's deputy stepped forward to collect formal statements for the prosecutor's office. He said firmly to Marlene, you'll want to contact a criminal defense attorney. This young lady's documentation is thorough enough for a grand jury. Sophie hadn't just exposed HOA corruption, she had built a criminal case strong enough to stand in federal court. Marlene stormed out, shouting empty threats of lawsuits, while the community surrounded Sophie with congratulations and gratitude. Honey, said Rose Kellerman, tears welling in her eyes, you saved our neighborhood. Sophie glanced around at the faces of neighbors who, for the first time in years, were speaking to each other with honesty. Then she smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen since Sarah's funeral. Mom would be proud, she whispered. Justice had been served by a 12-year-old with a 3-ring binder and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. 2 weeks later, criminal charges were officially filed against Marlene, embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The prosecutor, impressed by Sophie's detailed evidence, called it the most organized civilian case package we've ever seen, especially from a 12-year-old. Our civil lawsuit recovered $73,000 in misappropriated funds plus penalties. Marlene was forced to sell her house to pay restitution, leaving Pineview Shores in disgrace, with Bradford Pierce's legal bills unpaid. Dad, Sophie said one afternoon as we watched the moving truck haul away Marlene's furniture, Mom always said cheaters eventually get caught. The transformation of our community was nothing short of remarkable. With Sophie's input on family-friendly policies, we rewrote the HOA bylaws, adding term limits, requiring full financial transparency, and establishing true democratic decision-making. Monthly dues dropped by 30% once Marlene's fraudulent fees and inflated contractor charges were eliminated. Projects were now chosen by homeowner vote, and our very first was Sophie's idea, a memorial garden. Using the recovered funds, the Sarah Blackwood Memorial Garden became the new heart of Pineview Shores. Sophie designed the layout herself. Sunflowers for joy, lavender for peace, roses for remembrance. At its center stood a reading bench overlooking the lake, where Sophie often sat with her homework, remembering the woman who taught her that truth mattered more than comfort. But the most profound transformation was in Sophie herself. The quiet, withdrawn child who had arrived 8 months earlier had grown into a confident advocate for justice. She even founded a junior community advisory committee for neighborhood kids, teaching them about civic engagement and the importance of standing up for what's right. "I want to be a lawyer like Dad, someone who helps families, like Mom did," Sophie declared one evening as we watched the sun dip behind the lake. The healing wasn't just Sophie's, it was mine, too. Our research partnership had given both of us purpose through grief. Watching my daughter find her voice while honoring her mother's memory proved that loss doesn't mean surrender. Our story went viral when Channel 7's 12-year-old exposes HOA corruption. It was shared nearly 90,000 times across social media. Letters poured in from kids in other communities dealing with similar problems, inspiring Sophie to create a kid's guide to HOA rights, which we made free to download. The ripple effect reached far beyond Pineview shores. I began consulting with other communities, using Sophie's meticulous research methods to uncover fraud. Together, we helped expose corruption in 23 additional HOAs, recovering over $500,000 for families who thought they had no way out. But the most meaningful change was symbolic: Sophie's new swing set. After months of planning, she chose the perfect spot overlooking the lake where her mother once loved to read. On installation day, she spent hours swinging, sometimes with law books borrowed from my office, sometimes with novels that simply made her laugh. "Mom," she whispered one evening to the framed photo in her room, "I think we did good. The lake is safe again, and I'm not scared anymore." Our first annual Sarah Memorial Garden Party drew the entire neighborhood. Sophie played her mother's favorite songs on the piano while kids ran through sprinklers and parents swapped stories of neighbors helping neighbors. "You know what the best part is?" Sophie asked later, as we cleaned up together. "Mrs. Rodriguez's kids aren't afraid to ride their bikes anymore. And Mr. Kellerman actually smiles now." She was right. We had built something Sarah would have been proud of, a community where families could thrive, free from fear of petty tyrants and arbitrary rules. The garden still flourishes, cared for by volunteers who understand that even from the worst soil, beautiful things can grow. Sophie tends her mother's roses each morning before school, and every evening we sit together on Sarah's bench, reflecting on our day. Sometimes the darkest moments in life become the foundation for something better, something that protects others. Sometimes a 12-year-old with a notebook and an unshakable sense of justice can change everything. And sometimes, fighting for what's right is the most powerful way to honor the people we've lost. Drop a comment sharing your own HOA nightmare. And remember, kids notice more than adults think. If this story inspired you and showed how young people can spark real change, hit that subscribe button for more justice-served stories. Because when families stand together, bullies don't stand a chance.